Brian's not here, so we'll be... All right, let me pray for us. God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the truth of who you are, Lord. I pray that as we talk about these other worldviews, Lord, that you would help us to be equipped to be witnesses for you, that we would shine as lights in the darkness, Lord. And I pray that you would just give us wisdom as we think through these things, and pray that you'd be honored in our time. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I'm going to move this up a little bit. So today, we are starting a new worldview sort of thing, the rise of the nuns, which after Scientology last week, you might think that the nuns are some sort of a cult, and some strict, sounds like it could be a cult, the rise of the nuns, but it's not. The nuns are those who do not claim any religious affiliation. So, and this is the worldview that is probably on the rise the most in the United States. Here's some statistics. You can see this is the growth of religiously unaffiliated, and that graph on the left, these are Pew Research polls. And so you can see the steep upward climb of the nothing in particular, people who just say, yeah, nothing really, I'm not religious, I'm just cruise along, you know. And that's far higher than people who actually claim, no, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, or an agnostic who says, I'm not sure if there's a God. So here's another thing. Are you looking for a religion that would be right for you? And this is among those who identify their religion as nothing in particular. So it's just people who said, no, I don't really have a religion. And then they ask them, okay, well, are you looking for a religion? And they're like, 88% would say, nah, not really looking, not really interested. 10% said, yeah, I'm looking. And 2% was like, I don't know. So the religious affiliation by age, if you look at this, people who report, if you're 65 and plus, 90% of people would say they have some sort of religious affiliation. But as you get younger, the younger you get, the greater the percentage of people who say, no, I don't really have any religious affiliation. There may be some of that that's just as you go throughout life, you develop a religious affiliation. But there also might be some of that that seems to be that religious affiliation is just declining in general. Here's another one. These are questions. Is the Bible inspired, the inspired word? Do you ever pray? Do you ever attend religious services? Do you affiliate with any religion? Do you believe in God? And you can see how precipitous the drop is in people who say that. So this is probably the greatest worldview on the rise in our culture, is people who are just saying, I don't really have any religion in particular. And there's different forms that this can take when you get to the heart of it. And so what we're doing today is ambitiously trying to cover all of these views. So we have deism, agnosticism, atheism, nihilism, postmodernism, and Marxism. We are going to get through all these views, all these isms. So let's go through these. Who knows what these are? What's deism?
I'm going to take a stab. I'm not sure. That God created things and then left it alone for us to just...
Yes. God exists, but he's not really involved in the world. Okay?
Or like the
watchmaker, right? He winds up a watch. That's the famous deist analogy. It's like he wound up the watch and he just lets it go. He's hands off. God is hands off. So it's
I heard it from my oldest son, that he learned in college that most of the founding fathers were deists.
Yes.
I don't think that's true.
It is.
Is it?
Well, so that's a big debate. But there were certainly deism was a tremendous fad at that time in history. And so there were certainly some of the founding fathers that were deists, especially Thomas Jefferson, and there was some others that were for sure deists. When you look at the definition of deism and you look at some of the writings of other founding fathers, some founding fathers who people claim are deists, it's difficult to square a lot of their statements about Jesus in the Bible with classical deism that they would have been in that day. So that's a debate among historians, but I think were some. I don't think it's a majority personally. I think it was a minority, but there were some for sure who were deists. So agnosticism, what is this?
Might be a God.
Yeah, there might be God. I don't know if there's a God.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a God. I don't know if God exists. And there's different forms agnosticism can take. You can be a hard agnostic that says you can't know if there's a God. Or there can be a soft agnostic who just says, I just personally don't know if there's a God. Does that make sense? Okay. Atheism, we know this one. God does not exist. Nihilism, there is no meaning, hope, or value. Okay, this is atheism taken to its logical conclusion. This is saying not only, and you need to understand this, not only is there no meaning in life, but I have no ability to actually know what's real, to know, I don't have any anchor, any transcendent anchor. When Friedrich Nietzsche said, God is dead, he was espousing this view. He wasn't saying that God is dead in the sense he doesn't exist. He was saying God is dead in the sense that we now are living lives that are devoid of any use of God. And because of that, we have no transcendent anchor for anything in our lives, no meaning, no value, nothing that we can look to as actually good. Life is completely absurd. That's nihilism, okay? Postmodernism. Okay, this one is difficult to define, but I'm going to give you a quick definition and we'll come back to all these. This is an incredulity toward meta-narratives. Is that cleared up? Okay. What's a meta-narrative? A meta-narrative is an overarching story about the way the world is, okay? So all the different religions we've looked at, every worldview you can think of is a meta-narrative. It's a story about the way the world is. And what postmodernism would say, it says, I'm kind of incredulous that there is an overarching meta-narrative. I think, and what this ends up being is a radical form of relativism. Okay, so if you think of relativism and then put it on steroids, that is postmodernism, okay? And then Marxism. Who knows what's Marxism? By our good friend Karl Marx. He's not our friend, but he says religion is the way of maintaining power over the masses, okay? So we'll talk more about that. But these are like brief definitions. And what you should know is that all of these, every one of these views, all of the nones, is practical atheism. That's the way I would define this. It's that, and the Bible clearly talks about this. It says in Romans 13, it's going through, it starts showing that all the Greeks have sinned, all the Jews have sinned, and then it just gets into everybody have sinned, for we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And it has this list of just going, there's no one righteous, not even one. And then at the end of that list, it concludes with this statement in Romans 3:18. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And what that means is not just that they don't experience any emotion of fear, it's that the way that they live shows an utter disregard for God. They live as though there is no God, okay? And all of these worldviews at bottom will do, this is what their worldview is. Practically, they are atheists. They live as if there is no God. Psalm 14:1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, right? And so that's what these views are doing. It's, there is no God, I'm not accountable, I don't have to live in any certain way, there's not rules and constraints on my behavior, I can live the way I want. One last verse is Psalm 36:1. It says this, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for he flatters himself in his own eyes, that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. So that is what all of these views have in common. That's what's kind of binding them together. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me give you a sociological portrait of this person. This is taken from a sociological study on the rise of the religiously unaffiliated, and this is what this person probably looks like if you met them, okay? Just statistically. So, he is a he. Probably is more probable to be male. He's liberal or moderate. He's probably a Democrat. He's not necessarily an atheist. He's not necessarily hostile towards religious institutions. He just doesn't want to belong to one. He thinks abortion and same-gender marriage should be legal. He's white. He's young. He's not very religious, and he's more likely a Westerner living in the western half of the United States. So how many of us know someone like this? Okay, see, we all know people in this boat that this describes because this is a view that is on the rise. Now, there's different ways that people think of themselves, okay? So if we think of these different quadrants, let's go through and describe some of these. What would somebody look like in this bottom left quadrant?
Not religious. Atheist.
Yeah, people who might self-identify as an atheist or agnostic, right? That's how they would describe themselves. Or they might, it's somebody who just, yeah, I'm not really into that. That's not really a part of my life. No, I'm not really there. What about this top left quadrant?
Pharisee.
What?
A Pharisee.
The Pharisee.
Right. Somebody who is going to church and going through the motions. They're all about religion, they're all about but there's no heart to it. There's no true spirituality. There's no connection in relationship with God, okay? It's all about, it's churchianity, right? That's the way you might describe it. I just watched a TV show where a mom wanted her 2 kids to get baptized. She's like, you are getting baptized, and because it's gonna save your soul. And the kids are like, but I don't believe in God, Mom. I don't, and she's like, I don't care if you believe. You're getting baptized. That's somebody in that quadrant. Okay. Okay, and then the top right quadrant is probably somebody who is actually engaged in a church and somebody who does have a real relationship with Jesus. But what's really interesting is this bottom right quadrant. Okay. I'm spiritual, but not religious. How many of us have heard that? I'm spiritual, but not religious. So if you are to claim this, you're not an atheist, probably. You still believe in God or a force, and you still might whisper a prayer every now and then. You're open to spirituality, but you don't want to be tied down to anything specific. Right? So when it comes to a specific church or a dogmatic statement of truth or orthodoxy or anything that's spelled out as a system of beliefs or membership, you're not part of that. You're rejecting that. Okay? And so when you're pressed, you might say, "Oh, I'm not really religious, but I am spiritual." So how do we respond to somebody in that camp? What would you guys say? Any ideas?
Mars Hill. Paul's speech on Mars Hill.
Paul's speech on Mars Hill, Acts 17. So, yeah, he calls out certain things and says, I see that you worship many gods, right? And let me tell you about the Creator God who made all things, right? And so that's a great way to do it. Yeah, that's a good model. Let me give you some ideas. There's a guy named Ross Douthat who's a New York Times columnist, and he is a Catholic, I believe. But he wrote a book called Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, that is focused on this particular viewpoint that says I'm spiritual but not religious. And he says the big problem in the United States is not necessarily the rise of atheism or agnosticism, because those are relatively small amounts of people going to those belief systems. What's really dangerous is the people just becoming heretical without even realizing it, just drifting into quasi-pagan spirituality, very similar to the ancient Greek gods had. I mean, without realizing it. The ancient Greeks had with their gods. So how do we respond to this view? Here's some tips. These people are heading, first of all, to what Ross Douthat calls bad religion. Let me describe what he says. This is where they're headed. Okay, they're not there. They're heading here. And this is the religion of Oprah, the Church of Oprah, The View, Ben Kenobi. I mean, this is where mainstream media, the religion they believe without spelling it out, okay? That all organized religions offer only partial glimpses of God or light or being, or however you want to define him, okay? God is everywhere and within everything, especially you, okay? Sin and evil are largely illusions that will ultimately be reconciled rather than defeated. So now we need to work on reconciliation and love is love. We want to focus on these things, and there's not real sin. And perfect happiness is available right now. But as you get some sort of enlightenment, as you become aligned with the universe, as you get in the right spot, get the right energy going, then you're going to have perfect happiness. So this is what these people are headed towards. People who are spiritual but not religious, they're headed towards this viewpoint. But notice they're headed towards it. There's going to be, they're not really totally here. They're just like on different parts of the spectrum headed here. Does that make sense? It's very undefined. It's very loosey-goosey, but these are 4 kind of tenets that they'll head towards. Any questions so far? Okay, so how do we respond to them? First, I think we can point out spirituality is not just a feeling, but must be rooted and anchored in reality. And so exploring what they mean, when you say you're spiritual, what do you mean by that? Is there any anchor to it? Spirituality it's like a rope, and the rope has to be tied to something. What's it tied to? What's your spirituality tied to? What is it that it's anchored in? And that's a difficult question for the spiritual but not religious, because they are not, it is just a feeling for them. Yeah.
Anchor be something like a religious text?
Yeah, that could be an anchor for them. And if they can say that, that's at least a starting point, right? That's a good place for conversation. If they say it's a religious text that's anchored in the Quran, you can say, oh, well, let's talk about the Quran. You can get to it. But just this vague that I'm spiritual as a sense of feeling. My wife, my family in 2020 stayed in England in this Airbnb that we found, and in the midst of COVID. And the person it was their house, and they were living over here. And so, anyway, when we walked in, it was basically Athens in ancient. I mean, everywhere you looked was an idol. There's like, oh, a Buddhist idol. I wonder if they're Buddhist. Oh, well, there's a Hindu idol. Oh, there's a bunch of crystals. And so, anyway, it was like everywhere we looked, there was little idols, and this was this person. They were just like spiritual. We told them they were really concerned about their husband, and Melissa prayed for their husband, and she's like, and then she told us the next day that she did a meditation for us, and so this is this person. So that's the first thing. Secondly, while there may be some good in various religions, they fundamentally disagree about the nature of God and reality. Now, I'm saying we want to approach these people in a way that's wise and gentle. So saying and pointing this out is really important, but doing it in a way that doesn't make you come off as completely judgmental. Because as soon as you sound judgmental, this person is going to close their ears. They're not going to be listening to you. So being able to say this in a way, and think about math. If I said 2 plus 2 is 5, there's a big difference between saying that and 2 plus 2 is 278. And so some religions are closer to the truth than other religions. Would you agree with that? Like a headhunter in the middle of the wilderness is further from the truth than maybe a Christian or something, and you think about how you might word that, but just helping them see that different religions have different degrees of truth. And then pointing out that
even though there's differing degrees of truth, these religions are not compatible. Because while there may be superficial similarities, at the heart of these religions is fundamental differences. So, for example, the Dalai Lama says that you cannot be a Christian and a Buddhist because these worldviews are fundamentally not aligned. And he says there's no such thing. These are different worldviews. These are different viewpoints. They're not compatible. And to be able to articulate that and explain that is a really helpful thing to be able to do. And that's why we're in a class like this, where you can explain there is fundamental differences at a deep level between these views. So the disagreements are not trivial. They disagree about the nature of God, about who Jesus is, about how we enter into salvation and relationship with God. And so we need to be able to talk intelligently about these views and show the differences. Third, I would focus on the exclusive claims of Jesus, because people like this typically want a piece of Jesus. They want Jesus to be part of their worldview. Jesus was enlightened. Jesus knew about this stuff. You know, he's somebody that, I mean, I think he's got some good things to say. That's what they'll say. And so then you can say, well, let's think about this. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus claimed to be the exclusive, unique revelation of God. He claimed to be God in a way that nobody wasn't. He said, before Abraham was, I am. He claimed to be the creator God of the entire universe. And so you either disagree with that or agree with that. You guys have probably heard C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, Lord argument. There's a reason why that comes up so often today. It's because it's very powerful in reaching this type of person. And the final thing is, I'd say, gently expose the self-authorizing, self-deception that's at the heart of this claim. And so, what you want to expose is that this is a way for people to be their own authorities and pick and choose what they believe without having to have any real commitment or any sort of organized religion or any beliefs that make them really accountable. So this is a way of me being able to feel good about myself while I'm choosing what I want to believe. You think about Thomas Jefferson, you know, he actually took the Bible, he was a deist, and so he took the Bible and he cut out certain parts of the Bible and said, not going to believe these parts, but these other parts are okay. Anything supernatural, we're going to get rid of. And he actually published a Bible without any supernatural stuff in it, that he just kind of his own making. And, you know, having a conversation, what do you think about that? Is that okay to do? Can you just pick and choose? I mean, if you really believe in a God, does he have any authority over your life? Is there any way that you behave that's different than you'd want to behave? Or maybe asking this person, do you ever disagree with God? Does he ever disagree with you? You know, if God ever disagrees with you, does he have something to say about how you live and anything about that? So expose the self-authorizing deception at the heart of this claim. Okay, any questions so far? All right, let's see how we're doing on time. Yeah, there's the modern version of the Thomas Jefferson Bible. All right. All right. So now I want to talk about how do we respond to atheism, okay? And I want to give you a few tips on how to respond to atheism and agnosticism, because when you attack these viewpoints, these nuns, you're going to run into people who back up and do, well, I just don't know. Or they go to atheism and say, I don't believe in a God. And so how do we respond to an atheist or agnostic? I think these are some helpful things to know. I'm going to give you 3 things to talk through. The first is defining atheism, learning to talk through that. Secondly is the hiddenness of God. And third is understanding the relationship of science to atheism and relationship of science to atheism and to Christianity. Okay, so let's start with that first one, defining atheism. There's 2 different ways atheism is defined. One way is a belief in the non-existence of God. The second one is lacking belief in God or gods. What's the difference between those 2 definitions?
One's a religion.
One has a belief. One has a belief, one doesn't.
Okay, one has a belief and one doesn't. The top one is how, in everyday common language, we think of atheists. That is the common definition. Somebody who believes in the non-existence of God. The bottom one is taking atheism, like when we say somebody is amoral. It's a privation. It's that they don't have morality. So this is somebody who's just not a theist. And this is, if you're talking to an atheist who is at a popular level, has done some research, they'll probably try to define themselves in this way. And the reason for that is because it removes the burden of proof. Okay, they don't have any burden of proof because they have no belief, right? There's nothing they have to prove. Does that make sense? And so, what's the problem with that? Well, there's a few. One, it conflates atheism and agnosticism. It turns somebody who says I'm an atheist and somebody who says I'm an agnostic into the same thing, because both are saying I just lack belief in God, right? So it's that if both those views lack belief in God. Secondly, it's not how anyone commonly uses the word atheist. In fact, if you talk to somebody and they define themselves this way, as you press them, you'll start to see that they're not even being consistent in how they refer to themselves, because they're sort of saying things that show they actually disbelieve in God rather than just lack belief in God. And so they're inconsistent in how they use this typically. Third, it concedes all the atheological arguments. And so I like to point this out. So what you're saying is the problem of evil doesn't disprove God. The problem of, the incoherence of theism, the hiddenness of God, and I'll just run through arguments that atheists use that say, oh, so you're saying none of those work. So you're giving up a lot of ground by saying, oh, I just lack belief in God. It's not that I disbelieve in God. Does that make sense? Okay, and finally, it reduces atheism to a trivial claim. This means that, guess what? Cats are atheists because they lack belief in God. And rocks are atheists. Those chairs, guess what? They're atheists. And like, it's just completely, it makes atheism a trivial claim. Why should I care at all and why should we even have this conversation if you're just saying, I just lack belief in God, right? Okay, so that's some ways to respond to think about the definition of atheism. Okay, secondly, responding to the hiddenness of God. This is an argument I think you'll hear often from people who've thought through atheism. And what they'll say is, why, if God exists, why wouldn't he just make it completely clear that he exists? I mean, why doesn't he just show up ready? Why doesn't he just show up? And they might hear him say, I challenge God to show up right now and show me he exists. And things like that, And they'll, things where they're just like, why wouldn't he make himself more clear? And so how do we respond to that? What we need to think about, is absence of evidence of absence? You guys understand that phrase? Is a lack of evidence, not having evidence, is that itself evidence of absence? And the answer to that is absence of evidence. Okay, that was a big sentence, so I'm going to go slow. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence only in cases in which, were the postulated entity to exist, we should expect to have some evidence of its absence. Let me give you an example. If I told you that in the next room, right over there is an elephant. There is a full-grown adult elephant in that room. Would anybody believe me?
No.
No. Why?
Because it wouldn't fit.
And because you would have some evidence. If there was an elephant in there, there'd be some evidence. There'd be some smells coming out. There'd be some noises. There'd be something going on in that room that would tell you there's an elephant right over there. There's some thumping around. Now, if I told you, now guys, in that room, you're not going to believe this, but in that room, there is a flea. How many of you might believe me?
Many.
Yeah, because you would not expect to have a ton of evidence if there was a flea in that room, right? Now that's the point of this, is absence of evidence is evidence of absence if we should expect there to be more evidence than there is. So that changes the question. It means, how much evidence should we expect there to be of God's existence if God existed? Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so so this says absence evidence is evidence of absence, provided it's not something that might leave no traces, and we have comprehensively surveyed the area where the evidence would be found if the entity existed, right? So you have to have seen, if I told you there's an elephant in this building, and you haven't looked in the gym, then maybe there actually was, because you haven't checked out the gym yet. Okay, so that's part of how to respond. And so the question is, should we expect there to be more evidence than there is? But here's the thing. On a Christian worldview, God's great goal is not to get us to believe that he exists, is it? No, what's God's goal?
To glorify him.
Bring glory to his name, to what? Okay, to bring people into relationship with himself, right? That's what he's trying to do, is bring people into relationship. And so the question is, if God wants to build a real love relationship with us, would more evidence actually be conducive to that? Because the Bible tells us that demons believe in him, and do they have a relationship with him? No, they tremble, right? And so now, if we're going to put or have a relationship with God, we have to believe that he exists. Right? Let me read you this quote from J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig. Okay, it's kind of small up there, but I'll read it. It says, "There is no reason to think at all that if God were to make his existence more manifest, more people would come into a saving relationship with him. Mere showmanship will not bring about a change of heart." It is interesting that as the Bible describes the history of God's dealings with mankind, there has been a progressive interiorization of this interaction with an increasing emphasis on the Spirit's witness to our inner selves. In the Old Testament, God is described as revealing himself to his people in manifest wonders, the plagues upon Egypt, the pillar of fire and smoke, the parting of the Red Sea. But did such wonders produce lasting heart change in the people? No. Israel fell into apostasy with tiresome repetitiveness. If God were to inscribe his name on every atom or place a neon cross in the sky, people might believe that he exists. But what confidence could we have that after time, they would not begin to chafe under the brazen advertisements of their Creator, and even come to resent such effrontery? In fact, we have no way of knowing in a world of free creatures in which God's existence is as obvious as the nose on your face that more people would come to love him and know his salvation than in the actual world. So then, the claim that if God existed, he'd make his existence more evident loses all of its steam. Does that make sense? Okay. The final thing I think would be helpful to respond to an atheist is to understand the relationship of science and Christianity and atheism. So, let's do that. Okay. Now, my overall claim on this point is twofold. It's that, one, there is superficial concord, but deep conflict between atheism and science. And two, there is superficial conflict, but deep concord between Christianity and science. Okay? You guys got that? And one of the best books to read on this is this book right here by Alvin Plantinga. It's not a light read, but it's a great book by Plantinga is a Oxford, the head of the philosophy department at Oxford, not Oxford, at Notre Dame. He was for many years. I think he's retired now, but awesome book on this issue. So let's talk first about deep conflicts between atheism and science. What are these deep conflicts between atheism and science? I'm going to just give you a few, and I'm going to go through these kind of quick. Okay, so if you have questions, please let's talk about them, because I have a lot of notes on this, but I need to move quickly. So atheism cannot account for human free will and rational deliberation. So if you're an atheist, you believe the universe is naturalistic, which means all that we are is made of matter, right? There's no immaterial component to us. We are matter machines, very complex material machines. And if we are material machines, then we act just as a machine does. That means we have certain inputs, and we are going to give outputs based on those inputs. And so we have certain stimuli that stimulates us, and we will act based on those stimuli. And so if that's the case, then that means we may feel that we have free will, but we are not actually exercising any sort of genuine freedom in making decisions. We are just responding to the stimuli that are acting upon us, as complex as those stimuli may be. Yeah?
And then how come some humans act differently than others in response to those stimuli?
Well, and then atheists would have to say because those stimuli are not exactly the same, they're different. And secondly, they have to say that part of that is your own genetic code and your own makeup. And so you are unique in your genetics and in your experiences in the past. And so on atheism, you have to say you're a product of your experience. You're a product of your experience and your genetics, and you can't get out of that. That's who you are, because there is nothing more to you than that. So because of that, they don't have genuine free will, and they can't deliberate and make rational choices. Even the choice to be an atheist is determined by stimulus and experiences outside of their own control. And so because of that, they can't actually make decisions, deliberate, and be rational in their choices. Okay? It's very difficult for a genuine atheist to give a rational account of human freedom. And the atheists I've seen who are the most sophisticated will bite the bullet and say free will is an illusion. It is an illusion, and that's just the bottom line. It is an illusion, and I'm just doing my best to navigate in the world that I found myself in. So, but it's an illusion. I'm trying to survive. We're all trying to survive. So, okay. Secondly, atheism cannot account for our ability to trust our own senses and mental states. Okay, this is an argument. Alvin Plantinga, that philosopher I mentioned in that book, he wrote this book, 21 or so arguments against naturalism. It was a paper he wrote at a philosopher, and it just like a bomb. He's just like, woo! Just like these arguments, just like, oh, here's 21 or so arguments, and it's all new arguments that nobody had ever heard of, and this was one of them. And the way he framed it is an evolutionary argument against naturalism. And what he said is, if evolution is true, then that means that we as a species are geared towards survival, right? We are trying to survive. And so if a lion is chasing a gazelle, that the gazelle is going to run away from him, and the gazelles who run the most are the ones who are going to live longer, and so they'll pass on that trait to other gazelles, and then they'll live the longest. We're wired to survive, and that's part of who we are. And then he explains the problem is being wired to survive is not the same thing as being wired to ascertain truth. And so the gazelle could be running because it thinks it's in mortal danger, or the gazelle could be running because it thinks it's a really fun game of tag. And so, right, it doesn't really matter why the gazelle's running. What matters is if the gazelle survives. And so this is a very long and sophisticated argument. There's entire books written on this. But the point is, because of that, if evolution is true, we have no reason to trust that our sensory faculties and our mental states gather truth rather than merely help us survive. Does that make sense? So atheism can't account for us to trust our own mental states or senses. And this is why I think the logical result of atheism is nihilism, is purposelessness. Because you can't even trust what you see. You can't trust what you think. You can't trust your own mind on atheism. There's no transcendent ground or anchor. Now, if God exists, then we believe that God has created us in such a way that we can ascertain truth, to understand truth, that things are orderly, all sorts of things, okay? Third thing, atheism cannot account for philosophical assumptions that undergird science, okay? And let me give you some of those. The existence of a theory-independent external world, the orderly nature of the external world. You know, we do a scientific experiment one day, we expect if we do it the next day under same conditions, it's going to be the same thing. Why think that? An atheist can't give an account of why they think that. The knowability of the external world, the existence of truth, the laws of logic, reliability of our cognitive and sensory faculties to serve as truth gatherers and a source of justified beliefs in the intellectual environment, adequacy of language to describe the world, the existence of values used in science. For example, you should report theories fairly. uniformity of nature and induction, the existence of numbers and mathematical truths. All things that science itself cannot explain. Let me show you, this is a debate. This is the first debate I ever attended. It looks so old now. I'm like, oh man. I was actually at this debate.
What year is it?
This is 90s. Like probably 1997, 98, I don't know, somewhere around there. I was 17, 18. So anyway, first debate I ever attended, and I'm gonna just show you this. It's between William Lane Craig, who is one of my heroes, and Peter Atkins, who's not. Oh, let me give you some volume.
The reason why people believe, desperate to believe, together with the fact that you don't need actually a God, in a sense amounts to an argument against the existence of God.
Well, I guess I don't see that. I mean, why doesn't that commit the genetic fallacy of trying to say that by explaining how a belief originates, you thereby show the belief to be false? Even if it were true that belief in the existence of God were the product of fear and anxiety and so forth, which I don't for a minute admit, but even if it were, that's simply a genetic fallacy to say that because that's the way the belief originates, that therefore the belief is false.
But that's only one half of the argument. I'm not saying that that alone is accurate, and I'm not saying that the fact that science can account for everything alone is also adequate. But taken together, the fact that science is omnipotent, and the fact that I can understand why people like you desperately want to believe in God. That is an argument against the existence of
But
God.
two fallacious arguments put together don't make a sound argument, right?
Yeah, but do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science...
So what can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
So none of these beliefs can be scientifically proven, and yet they are accepted by all of us, and we're right.
All right. Okay.
Did he respond to all that?
Yeah, not very well though. He was a little bit.
Deer in the headlights.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you see that guy?
Yes. So science is not he said science is omnipotent, which I was like, oh my goodness, like he said that, and then yeah, science is not omnipotent. Okay, let's talk about Christianity and science now. We talked about atheism and science. Christianity and science. So my point was that there is superficial conflict, but deep concord between Christianity and science. So let me tell you a few places where superficial conflicts arise. One, superficial conflicts arise when we treat the Bible as a science book. When we treat the Bible as if it was, a physics textbook. And so we see passages in the Bible that says the sun rose in the east. And if we say the sun doesn't actually rise, the earth is rotating on its orbit, of course, that's so, and that's silly because the Bible's using what's called phenomenological language, language that's describing it from the standpoint of the earth, right? And it does understand an earth looks like the sun rises from east. So if I gave you a newspaper and it said Indians kill tigers, what would you think happened? So people in India, they've had a big tiger problem, they've been executing tigers. What if it was on a sports page? If it was on a sports page, you'd have a whole different meaning, right? So we need to, that's because it's a certain genre of literature, and we have to interpret the Bible according to the type of literature that it is, not according to the type of literature it isn't. Okay? So taking it, treating it like a science book, is going to cause all sorts of superficial conflicts to arise. Secondly, superficial conflicts arise when we don't understand the limits of science. There are specific questions that science addresses, like what is a covalent bond and how does that work? What is the structure of a methane molecule? Where will the moon be on November 1st, 2062? Science can address those questions, but there's a lot of questions that science can't answer, as Craig just pointed out. For example, what is science? And what makes something count as science? What is, and even, should scientific results be reported honestly? All sorts of questions that science can't address. And some questions are a mix of science and philosophy. So for example, do electrons exist? And are they a useful way of explaining the scientific data? That is both a scientific question, but it's also a philosophical question about the nature of matter. And scientists are not the expert in a big part of that question. So understanding that there's very limits to science and what it can study and address. Christianity provides a worldview in which the assumptions of science are best justified. Science, there is a reason why the majority of important scientific discoveries have happened in places where Christianity has first thrived and established a worldview. And the reason is because the worldview Christianity provides undergirds and supports what happens in science. So the assumptions include all the things I pointed out already, that we can trust our senses, that truth exists, that we can discover the truth about the universe. So all those sorts of things. And finally, Christianity makes sense of the beginning of the universe. Science itself will all tell you that in the universe began in a big bang, millions of years ago, billions of years ago, 4.6 billion years ago, right? That the universe began in a big bang. And what that is that time, space, and matter all came to existence. So time itself is what came into existence, is what the scientists say. And the very first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning, which is time, God created the heavens, which is space, and the earth, which is matter. There's a NASA astronomer named Robert Jastrow, and he said, for the scientist who's lived his life by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He scaled the final peak of the mountain of reason, and he's helped up to the top by a band of little theologians who've been there for centuries. So Christianity makes sense of the beginning of the universe. Christianity also makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe. What we find as we study the universe more and more is that the universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for life. And that extends both at the cosmological level of certain constants, the proportion of matter to energy in the universe, all sorts of physiological, to the place. And this is true to the point that it is beyond absurd to think that this happened by chance. There's no way that this could have possibly happened by chance. And in fact, one of the leading atheist philosophers of the past 50 years was a guy named Antony Flew. And Flew passed away about 10 years ago. But before he passed away, he said he had become a believer in God. And the reason why was because of the fine-tuning evidence of the universe. And he wrote a book called There Is a God. How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Great book. There's questions about whether he became a Christian at the end of his life. He was good friends with Gary Habermas, who's a strong Christian, who says he had shared the gospel many times with Flew. But anyway, interesting book. How he came to believe in God. All right. So we have covered atheism, agnosticism, spiritual but not religious, and it's 9:55. But here goes the question: how much can we get into postmodernism? In 5 minutes.
It's all
Should we
relative.
head in, or should we wait till next week? How many of our minds can handle heading in? 1. How many of our minds have to wait till next week? Okay, we'll wait till next week. So let me pray for us, and we'll head to church. God, thank you for who you are. Thank you that you have given us truth in your word, and that it's reliable and trustworthy. Lord, help us to honor you with our lives. Help us to honor you in how we live. I pray, Lord, that as we go to church, that you'd be honored and you'd speak through your word, that you'd allow us to worship you in spirit and truth, and help us, Lord, to be good witnesses to those around us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Next week, postmodernism.
Thank you.